Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Global Trends in Libraries, Challenges, and Changing Roles, which is sponsored by Springer Nature. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the button that looks like a little dialog cloud and a button labeled Q&A at the bottom of your screen to open those up. Please use the Q&A panel to submit your questions to each of our speakers today. At the end, we'll take a few minutes to answer your questions, so please do send them in throughout. And if you are experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat panel to let me know, and I'll troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRLChoiceWebinars during this event, so if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right, and our speakers today are Dan Penny and Robert Boise from Springer Nature. So to get started, I will hand the presentation over to Dan to kick things off.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Fantastic. I'm now the presenter. Hopefully I have control. Yes, it works. Wonderful. Hi, everybody. I'll introduce myself and Bob in a second. Just to say that today we're going to cover the survey that Springer Nature ran at the end of last year, and we'll talk about some of the key learnings from it. So first we'll talk a little about what we did, and then we're going to go through 3 themed areas from that survey and talk a bit about what Springer Nature is doing in these areas to try and support customers. And as Mark said at the end, there should be plenty of time for questions to be answered, so please fire questions off as we go through. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm Director of Market Intelligence at Springer Nature. I don't always look quite as grumpy as that photo suggests. I work in the Strategy and Market Intelligence group within Springer Nature. So I support all my colleagues around the world by doing market and customer research, bibliometric work, that kind of thing. And generally I focus traditionally on authors and researchers rather than librarians. So for example, we measure author satisfaction to improve submission systems and reviewing processes and make platforms better and that kind of thing. And I'm particularly interested in the interface at academic institutions between the library, the research office, and faculty. So that's part of what we were studying today. We'll come on to that to improve the communication of research generally, I guess. Over to you, Bob. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yes, my name is Bob Boise. I am Director of Account Development for Springer Nature. I've worked in the information industry for quite a number of years, and you may have seen me presenting at conferences, or you may have presented with me. My job in account development involves supporting libraries in terms of their post-purchase needs usually, and that means making sure that everything is working properly with electronic resources and that people have the kind of promotional and visibility tools that they need for their content. I'm very proud to have spent a good part of my career working with information standards. So you see mention of NISO topic committees, and glad to work with libraries in that way. And I was former president of NASIG, representing a long time working with in the journals serials field. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. Okay, so moving on to what we did and what we're going to talk about today. We created a survey of librarians. And really we wanted to understand 2 things. The challenges and responsibilities of librarians in current climate and the near future, and the role that publishers can, should, maybe, and shouldn't have in supporting librarians, faculty, and patrons in their own activities. It was clear that much of what we thought we knew about librarians much of it came from anecdotal evidence or from some rather outdated pieces of work. So we decided to create something that would be as open as possible for librarians to express very broadly what they felt were the biggest challenges and where publishers could or should and shouldn't play a role in some of those areas. So what we did is a little bit about the methodology. The survey was open for about 6 weeks, and we promoted it via our email channels, but also via social media and listservs. And we really wanted to encourage responses from a global audience. So we translated it into 7 other languages, which, as you can imagine, did make the answer analysis a little more challenging, but it was a great thing to do because it got a good range of responses from many different countries. And the results I'm presenting today are the global responses. The highest number of responses did come from the US, but we also got a substantial number of respondents from China, Japan, India, and several others. So partly because of that, we got a pretty good response from my perspective anyway, 770 responses. The work I often do with authors and researchers, I'm more used to several thousand responses, but actually, of course, the number we received from the librarian market, that was fine for us to be able to carry out statistical significance analysis on the things we were interested in. So that was a decent response. We were pleased. And the responses also came from a range of teaching and researching institutional libraries, but the vast majority carried out a significant amount of research. So the librarians sort of were the qualified libraries that we wanted to understand. And then following the survey, we then carried out 20 in-depth interviews to get some insight into why respondents had answered the way they did and put some meat on the bones of some of those answers. We've published a white paper that discusses the results in more depth than we have time to talk about today, and we'll talk a bit more about that white paper at the end of the session. So moving on, the areas that we covered in the survey, broad range of topics, covered a lot more than we have space for here. It included issues facing libraries and librarians, to differentiate between the two, ways of evaluating content, and so on and so on. Also, engagement with faculty in other areas, and also a little bit about what publishers do well and less well, and particularly about how Springer Nature is communicating. So we covered a wide range of areas. But key thing today, we want to focus on what's important. Given that I'm speaking to you from the UK and I'm a Brit, there's quite a debate going on right now on what's really important. Some of you will know we're going through something called Brexit, which is the name for the process of the UK leaving the European Union. But there's plenty of people who are suggesting that maybe focusing on Brexit, while science tells us that the climate's in trouble, is maybe not the right priority. So I just want to say that we're trying to prioritize here what things are that are most important. So the first of 3 areas that we found to be top library priorities. And first and foremost, budgetary challenges. So this question here was pretty upfront in the survey and asked people about what they thought were the major issues that were currently facing their library. And they could select up to 3 answers, but also add their own areas that they thought were particular challenges, which we then subsequently categorized and grouped together and added to particular answers that we had already preset. And we'll come back to this question a couple of times through the presentation today. But the first thing I want to talk about is the top of the list, that 48% lack of resources, chosen by 48% of respondents. I don't think it's a great surprise, the top concern being budgetary. That lack of resources, including staff, funding, and materials. And while all challenges reported by the interviewees also involve some financial demand or economic impact, several said it's also about balancing budgets and resources with changing demands. So it's not just about resources not being there, it's also about demands changing. A good quotation that illustrates, I think, what a lot of people said to us is this: institutional level austerity policies leave us without resources for material acquisition. So, going into that in a little more detail, there's some quotes here from both the interviews and the open text in the survey, which illustrates some of the various issues around budgetary concerns. And you can see, I won't read all of these out, but I don't think many of them are going to be surprises. You'll also see that at the bottom of the slide that a proportion of respondents also left some comments about publisher price increases being a major sensitive issue raised to this. So new journals launched by big name publishers at very high subscription rates, inability to sustain current collections because of average increase of 8% in cost of subs to biomedical journals. So the whole area of budgetary challenges, really there were sort of three general themes around this we can summarize them into. So to a certain extent, there was interest as a result in more customized, flexible models. The survey also asked about belief in moving away from the big deal in the future. There wasn't necessarily a consensus about what might replace big deal, but a majority of librarians said they believed there would be a move away from the big deal in the future. Respondents wanted to see more a la carte options and looking for smaller or customized packages. Another theme was the need to balance cost with value, and we're going to come back to that again actually a little bit later in the presentation. The issues are not purely financial. Budget lines need to be balanced numerically, but other priorities need to be balanced qualitatively. So, financial aspects rarely stood alone in the conversations we had, and in the interviews, often they were followed by discussions on making existing resources work harder, being creative about allocations and assessments, guiding principles for many libraries about focusing on the ease of doing business with publishers and other providers, and demonstrating the library's value to management and to researchers to make those budgetary decisions work harder. And related to that, going on to the next slide, we also asked a question about ways of evaluating content. So the question here, apart from faculty recommendation, what other criteria does your library consider when judging the value of subscription content? So again, I don't think we were very surprised by the top answer, cost per download, the most frequently used method used for evaluating content. But other almost as frequently used measures seem to be licensing terms, access rights, functionality of platforms. Alignment with university mission I was surprised that was so high, and I'd like to, I don't think we dug into that as much as I'd like to. I'd like to get into that a bit more to understand what people understood by that. But in the interviews, it was interesting how many participants did identify as being data-driven, but we also then talked about experimenting with newer, more qualitative methods for evaluating content acquisition. So licensing rights, platform functionality, those are not necessarily things that are as easy to use data to value. And of course, we recognize, and it came through from the interviews, that it's labor intensive to collate all these myriad data points for actionable assessments. And one quote that was quite nice, our understanding is that the driving goal for many participants is really, I think it was the head of collections and acquisitions, it was a large public US university, it's just about getting the right research into the right venue for a given author or faculty member. And all these things combine to make that challenge particularly difficult. So that's something that we pulled together as the first theme, the whole area of trying to balance cost and demonstrating library value. Bob's now going to talk about a little bit about what Springer Nature is doing in this area. Bob, can I hand over to you?
Yes, that would be great. So my job is to kind of talk a little bit about what we do in relation to some of the challenges that we're seeing. And of course, the survey was done just at the end of 2018. So in some sense, we're still kind of absorbing and considering. But certainly some things we do that many of you today will be easily relate to. Counter usage data is of course very important, and we're in a stage where we're transitioning from one iteration of the counter standards into another one. So we will be getting there and getting you the most up-to-date counter usage data. That is a kind of a demonstration of value that electronic resources have brought to the table that print resources, of course, didn't have. Circulation studies being, kind of different in the print world. We like to do long-term data for you to show the long-term effect of electronic resources. I was looking at one college breakdown of their budget today, and 88% of their material spending was on electronic resources, and it probably has been that number for a fairly long time. So we have this corpus of data, and we want to share it with you. Our normal account review covers 3 years, but we often go into more depth with that, especially if we're doing research with you in cooperation with you. One thing that we like to show is the money that you save your campuses when you invest in electronic books, especially electronic textbooks that are used in for curriculum purposes. Those textbooks effectively costing nothing to the student with unlimited concurrent use and no DRM, and very useful. We can show how much the library saved by licensing that content for their students. That number, you think it might not be that much, but in fact it can be in the tens of thousands of dollars even for smaller liberal arts colleges, and considerably more for larger universities. Something that we didn't used to think about in the academic library. Curriculum collection development is now something that we think about much more easily and readily. We also want to give you longitudinal authoring data to show the importance of our imprints with your faculty. Even though that wasn't rated quite as high in importance, it does have some importance. We're sure on the campus that you're investing in content that where your authors find that those imprints of value enough to publish there. We try to give a percentage of portfolio used. Some of our most important circulation studies in the United States, at least, over periods of like 20 years, showed 50% or less of print materials, print books especially, circulating. We believe we can show much higher value of a portfolio of electronic books circulating in a much shorter period of time, and so we do share that information with clients when they ask for it, and sometimes even when they don't. We like to do some work with citation analysis to show you, kind of another look at your local research, and we've begun sharing that in our account reviews when we visit you. And of course, then there's also the business of just making sure that your users know that when they land on one of our platforms, that the content that they're accessing is actually brought to them by your library. And so we want to make sure that you're able to demonstrate your value inside of these electronic resources and platforms. And so that logo, continues to be an important tool, and I hope that everyone who licenses content from us does use it. Okay, Dan?
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so moving on, the next area of the three we want to talk about, and all of these interrelate, of course, but roles and reputations. So back to this question again around the major challenges. The second area we want to talk about is the value of the library and the value of librarians to researchers. So items 3 and 5 on this list. Conveying the value of librarians to management and conveying the value of librarians to researchers, which are obviously similar sorts of topics. So really a good summary quote for this, I thought, came from one of the interviews. It's really about reiterating the positioning of the university library is biased towards doing things that you can't do well. You might mean the student, might mean the researcher, might mean whoever it might be. Focusing on what the university library can do well, can do better. It was clear that ensuring and communicating a positive return on an academic or research institution's investment in their library was paramount to participants in the study. Restoring, establishing, or maintaining a positive reputation for the library across campus was a focus for the respondents. And they talked about adopting strategies they describe as user-sensitive techniques and the importance of building ties with faculty to embed the library into teaching and learning. So we've got some other quotes here that give us a flavor of the kinds of things people said. Conveying the economic value and the cost of quality information sources, with the emphasis on quality there. Getting students to use and read, getting lecturers to see the value. Building ties, getting students to use the databases, patrons looking outside the library. That bottom one was a a red flag. Patents looking outside the library for research information is a sign that the value of the library isn't necessarily being appreciated as much as it might be. So nearly all interviewees, sorry, I moved on too quickly. Nearly all interviewees felt the library should be the campus hub and it should be the starting point for content discovery. But as a parenthesis, about a third talked about not offering an option for web scale search across all library resources. And even the majority that did currently have library discovery services in place talked about truly comprehensive search across all holdings, not always being available. Some providers being unable to integrate into licensed academic databases and open access and preprint archives. So it's complex, it's easier said than done. Related to this are the activities, though. So another question in the survey was asking about what activities the library is engaged in, and driving that value, conveying that value of the library is clear when it comes to the activities. So you can see in here the most popular answer was promoting greater content usage amongst faculty. 72% of people said that that was a key activity, as well as further down the list, 48% talked about promoting the institution's research output. And the way in which that was done, really came from some of the conversations we had, so as well as some of the open text in the survey. So, you know, for example, holding collaborative sessions with faculty to review usage and costs, that sort of partnership model for decisions and usage. Others talked about organizing collection decisions and budget approval by department, subject area, usually using subject liaisons, committees, that kind of thing. And it seemed that actually for many libraries a great deal more effort and focus was invested in hard science fields, whereas subjects in the humanities often constituted smaller or lower priority collections and was done in a different way, maybe more manageable to talk about. So that's one element of this. Another related question, which we got into a bit more depth with, was this next one. We're talking about the influence of the library, thinking about that relationship and that connection, the degree to which the library was influencing certain things. And this was interesting, that the respondents were more likely to think that the library was more likely to have a no influence than a strong influence over all three of the areas that we chose to ask about in the survey. And we could have chosen many other areas, but we limited it to three: good research practices, how research outputs measured, and to which journals the institution submits research. And you can see in that graph that the no influence tends to be between 28 or indeed 40% on the submission of journals, whereas the strong influence is only chosen by a relatively small proportion of respondents there. And that was reflected in other conversations and other questions too. You know, there was a split on whether libraries are core contributors to the vision of their institution. There are other questions where, for example, just over half of the interviewees felt the library was a peer with other stakeholders, partnering to achieve, you know, objectives around funding or disciplinary objectives, having insight into changes in enrollment or new fields of study or research assessment to impact strategies. Many, on the other hand, describe the libraries as support or service agencies, more rather than being partners, perhaps more responding to needs and priorities, having a service agreement. One European participant, who I don't necessarily think is necessarily representative, but did unfortunately report feeling that the library was seen as the university's internal Amazon service. So, you know, and I don't think they meant that positively. Nothing against Amazon, but okay. So we've got a few things here about the partnerships and the degree to which conveying the value of the library and the methods and techniques that are engaged here. But there's a big difference, I think, in terms of whether the library is that partner or is that service organization, and the degree to which it's able to be part of the conversations that are taking place amongst faculty. And so we have a few areas there where we're trying to help with driving usage, driving awareness, and it's something we feel quite strongly about. We have something to gain as well in doing it, in partnering with libraries on that. And Bob, I think you're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So one of the principal areas that we you know, kind of feel that we can help libraries expand their influence and expand their, you know, their reach into their own communities is by kind of being side by side on issues relating to discovery, and obviously a great discovery environment, benefits both parties, benefits the library, benefits the users for the library, and benefits certainly us as a publisher. The higher the use, the more value is placed on our content. And so the story of discovery begins at the very beginning with working with authors and rich metadata and accurate metadata, and always looking for issues around discovery. We know that my department in particular is focused very closely in account development on issues relating to discovery, things like adding table of contents and MARC records for our ebooks, and adding more access points wherever we can, and making them accurate. We understand that if things go wrong with a particular portfolio of content in electronic form, our advisory board has told us clearly the first thing they look for is a technical glitch. And so we work on that kind of thing all the time, keeping the DOI infrastructure solid, keeping access clear for all parties, and to this end, we made sure recently that we're part of the KBART automation NISO standard. That brings good metadata and updated holdings on both journals and books currently from the SpringerLink platform, but we'll add the nature.com platform soon. The KBART automation keeps you up to date on a weekly basis. And for journals that don't change as often in your collection, weekly sounds like overkill, but things do change. For books, it's not at all overkill because we publish, as you know, we're the biggest book publisher in the world, not just scholarly, but of any type. And we publish, dozens of books every week. And if you want your catalog to be as up-to-date as possible, then KBART automation is important. I said before, we're always thinking about search engine optimization, even when we're advising authors about things like keywords and abstracts, and especially titles of articles and chapters. Very important. We also promote activities where places like Montana State and their Open SESMO, that's search engine and social media optimization, their activities to kind of reach out into that middle layer in the public kind of search services to get people to their library of resources, when they might not think that the library resources were there, and so that kind of activity we certainly promote and provide a mouthpiece for good library research into discovery, and we love to do that. We in our account development group are each territorially looking at clients, looking at their usage of our content, trying to monitor that closely. Obviously, this is not a privacy thing. We're just looking at the gross numbers. And when something is not going well for a particular client, our group will intervene and talk to you and work with you on maybe making things better. Content that is underused does not make the library look great, and so we want to partner on that scale. We developed the term cooperative marketing, meaning that we don't, in our account development group, we do not market at you, we market with you. And we have certainly are starting to get into the business of handling data sets. We presented at ACRL on some of our data handling services. We're making good progress there. And basically, we're just trying to also work with you. We're very well known and liberal publishing house, actively working towards an open access world. 30% of our journal content last year in 2018 was published in an open access model. So we're making inroads there, and we try to make sure that you are aware of the value of open access content, including things like our approximately 700 open access ebooks, where you can get free MARC records for those, and some libraries that have not been able to get into the electronic book world in any way yet now can get in with quality content with those open access ebooks. Okay, Dan, I think that's enough from that.
Great, good stuff. Yeah, this is an area that engagement with faculty and being a partner, and that's something that we want to do as much as we can. And it sort of ties into the last thing I'm going to talk about theme-wise, which is serving researchers as users and authors. Going back to my little list again of challenges, here we're talking about, sorry, the formatting's not great, but we're talking about this second one down the list, understanding research trends and the librarian's role in the research cycle, that should say. Understanding the librarian's role in the research cycle for researchers. And that lower one down there, the lack of clarity on the library's role. So challenges around actually what the librarian's role really is across the research cycle. And to try and answer that and to try and get into that in a bit more detail, we had another question where we talked about what assistance libraries are giving to authors of research in particular. Clearly there's plenty we could ask about students, but we were particularly interested in authors. And you can see here, it's a little small, but you can see that 42% said that they provided advice on where to submit or on avoiding predatory journals. Promoting research was also fairly popular, help with submitting articles. Less so help with payments of article processing charges, and in fact actually that was much stronger in Europe. And then further down, use of services such as translation, finding grants, finding co-authors. But it was clear that actually librarians do, many, not necessarily a majority, but a significant chunk, do feel very engaged with authors and researchers. Many have a role in advising on submissions. I think avoiding predatory journals tends to be the go-to, but that then leads on to all sorts of further conversations around strategic publishing and decision-making, and indeed helping to think about what impact looks like, trying to lead the authors to think about actually what are they trying to achieve with their paper, what are the options out there, who are they trying to reach, what's the readership. And that's something that I really would like publishers to be playing a stronger role in helping librarians to advise authors on. That open access area, as I mentioned, uneven uptake across regions and fields of study, predominantly in Europe at the moment, but often mentioned as a driver of change by interviewees focused on growing the library's role in publishing, in that those looking for open access publication often, anecdotally, that's a signal that the author is potentially thinking broadly, more widely, investigating options, and then thinking about open access as an option then often leads to an opportunity for the librarian to then engage and talk about the ins and outs of doing that and what they're hopefully going to try and achieve and what that's going to result in terms of impact for the paper. Just to reference another study actually here, something that you might have seen, the Ithaca US faculty survey that came out a couple of weeks ago, April 12th, had a question that asked researchers how much they valued certain library services around authoring. And I think something like 20% of respondents reported that they receive help around understanding and negotiating favourable contracts, determining where to publish, and assessing impact. So that suggests that from that in the US, only around a fifth of faculty say that they receive help on that, but around a quarter said they'd value help. So there's certainly some demand there, and nearly 30%, I think that study said that faculty said they valued help in assessing the impact of research. So immediately, it's made me think it would be great to be able to see where there are locations where researchers say they'd value those services, but maybe where libraries are not yet able to offer that as widely as they would like, or where there is sort of an unmet need potentially there. So moving on from this area, just again, some areas around some of the quotes that came out around actually what are the challenges around the different parts of the role, that really broad range of different roles that the librarian increasingly needs to play. So, for example, that top left one, it's about how to select and approach quality journals so people can publish quality work, connecting the library with publishers in learning, selecting and getting publishing institutions' research work. It's about being aware, being a sort of central informational hub, a consultancy hub, being able to be up to date with the current situation on scholarly information distribution, trends, commercial publications, understanding models, being sort of an expert on that area. Another comment illustrating another theme that came out quite a bit was this issue with the network center, the IT department, whatever you want to call it, tech provision at the institution merging with the library and the functions of both becoming more ambiguous, that where the access provision sort of starts and ends. That came out a few times. And another area, a whole new area potentially for some people, it's a burgeoning area, data management needs, how the library may best provide support around researchers needing to manage their data sets, what the opportunities are for them, where they should be careful, where they need to fulfill certain funder requirements, for example. So all this stuff, grappling with these changing scholarly behaviors, changing infrastructural things going on in the institution. Many other studies have pointed out that researcher practices and pathways to scholarly content are seeing measurable shifts every few years. And there's a notable gap in the practices of librarians and the experiences of students, faculty, and other researchers. So we've got challenges felt both in libraries communicating with end users about their needs and libraries' ability to champion the lessons about users' experiences to management and to other stakeholders, and to put the focus on where the stakeholders want that focus to be put. Okay, so I'm going to talk now a little bit about the final thing, talking a bit about where we're going to try and bring things more closely together, the degree to which we see librarians being successful in engaging more with campus. And we've got a few examples. I think, Bob, you're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing and where we're seeing some success in being able to bring those groups together. There we go.
Well, yeah, there's just some examples of it sounds, I think, a little bit pretentious of us to think that we as a publisher can play a role in drawing the library, closer to its own campus. But in fact, that's part of what our goal is to boost and center the library on the campus as much as possible. It is self-serving because you're our clients and we want you to do well. One of the things that we did at a recent ALA Midwinter Lunch and Learn was we previewed for you what an event that was about authoring would look like on your campus, and how we would do that, and how we would talk a bit about publishing in general, but we would also ask you to use some of your local authors to discuss publishing tips with your own graduate students or undergraduates. Indeed, undergraduates are publishing more and more these days. And we had 4 schools that listened to the preview and signed up for an event right there and then. So that was nice to see that some of the libraries want to have an event that different topics, publishers can be knowledgeable and provide interesting information to your campus, but it's always brought to you by your campus library, and we make sure that we do that cooperatively and make sure that the library gets the credit for that kind of thing. In some parts of the world, author events can get hundreds of people into a venue, depending on which country you're in. So author events have continued to be very important. We like to sponsor library surveys and library research. We think this shows the non-library faculty that the library does research and that they are part of the research community. And so when we can, we provide things like incentives for people to take surveys. We know a lot of libraries do them routinely, but some do them, in more of an experimental research vein. So we've been involved in that kind of work over the years, and we continue to look for that kind of work. We also notice that, of course, every time a library does a survey, it reminds people that those resources exist, and that visibility stuff is what we're all about. We have done regional day summits. We've heard quite clearly from our library clients that the money for travel to conferences and face-to-face events is kind of not that great anymore. And so things like this webinar and also regional summits that we do in different parts of the country to provide, ongoing kind of programs, good keynote speakers, good panel discussions in the region about topics of interest to the region. Last year, one of the topics was called Recentering the Academic Library. We talked about elements of physical library design, collection development, and outreach projects to keep the library, the academic library, centered on its campus. We have certainly adopted text data mining language as well. We think that librarians and authors, this is a kind of research area where actually joint research by libraries and other elements of the campus shows promise for the future, and it's also an area where we think publishers can be right there in the thick of it, working with our content. And I think, although we haven't done too much formal work with universities yet, we continue to be involved in somewhat informal ways, and I think we're going to build up that part of our company to support that. I also will say that library vendor days, it used to be so in vogue, kind of when the world was first turning electronic to electronic journals and books, and then kind of went away, seem to be coming back again a bit to highlight just the sheer amount of electronic content that is available on the typical university and college campus. Okay, Dan.
Great, thank you. That, in a nutshell, we've gone through that reasonably rapidly, but I hope that was clear enough for everybody. We just wanted to mention the white paper. Everyone signing up to the event today, I think, is going to receive a copy of the white paper. But we also have a web address on there, just in case that wasn't going to happen. But that is going to happen. So everyone's going to receive that anyway, so you don't need to do anything on that. We now have a little bit of time to answer any questions that we've had coming in. We'll do our best between Bob and myself to try and answer those questions. I think, Mark, you're corralling those questions.
Absolutely. And I would just encourage folks, we get a few to start out here. But if you do have questions for either Dan or Robert, drop them in the Q&A module, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. All right. So I think a little bit earlier in the presentation, we had a question from Luke, and Luke was curious about the interviews and asked, were the in-depth interviews that were conducted all with U.S. librarians? No. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. No, they were global, but I actually sneakily just looked them up. 8 of them were from North America, 8 were from Europe, and 4 from the rest of the world. They were all conducted in English. We have some aims to follow up with some of the Chinese area libraries where we have some particular things we want to go and find out about, some different concerns there. But no, they were, I would say, a strong bias towards North America and Europe. But no, they were global.
That's very interesting, yeah, to know exactly what the breakdown was. Absolutely.
Sure.
We have a question here from a bit earlier referencing slide 19 by Amy, and I think it's a clarification really is what's needed. On slide 19, what do you mean by open access payments?
Okay. This is, I've just pulled back to slide 19 here. So this is 23% talked about facilitating open access payments and management. So this is related to libraries assisting authors in a whole range of different areas. Authors going to say, well, I want to publish open access, but I'm unable to, I don't have the funding. Where can you help me find some funding? Where should I go? And the librarians helping them out with doing that. All the way through to the technical side of this stupid form is asking me for some crazy number, and I don't know where to get that number from. And the librarian then stepping in and saying, well, I happen to have that number, or you know what, I'll get in touch with the publisher, or you know what, that happens once a week, and yeah, it's okay, you can ignore that, whatever it might be. So it's a whole range of different things. Clearly, we're still reasonably early on in the what will be an illustrious history of open access, I'm sure, and therefore there are all sorts of weird and wonderful things that need to happen. The payment structure is not as organized as it should be, but rapidly improving, I think, and librarians are playing a very strong role in helping faculty with engaging with those tricky issues around payment. In some cases, actually, sorry, just to append that,
Sure.
an area that I'm also particularly interested in, it's also about measuring and managing the institutional view of that aggregated open access payment. So looking at actually what the aggregated overall outgoings are in terms of open access payments by an institution, and looking at sort of, you know, effectively a return on investment type measures to try and get into actually what the strategic value is of those open access. So I'm very interested to hear from any libraries who are ahead of the game on that in terms of trying to really get an understanding of what their open access strategy should be. That's an interesting area to talk about. Sorry, long answer.
No, that's fine. It's all interesting. I especially was interested to hear how you know you're breaking down the management portion of that within the library. It's fascinating. And to move on to another question that we've got one from Melissa who asks, or sort of states and then asks, it's great that Springer Nature provides percent of portfolio used in citation analysis. Does Springer Nature also provide any benchmarking to help librarians make sense of those numbers?
Yeah, that's probably for me.
Yep.
Yes, we do that kind of work in account development about benchmarking because we also need to know when a library is performing fairly well with their usage, for example. And so I've done some research that looked at the U.S. Carnegie classes for, you know, comparing apples to apples libraries that had essentially the same, you know, kind of count of journals or count of books with us, and the kind of the usage of that content, and gotten different average numbers for the different Carnegie classes with, you know, kind of the same amounts of content to know what was essentially what was good use. And I looked particularly at peak periods when the best use could be judged. That is usually in the academic library in the October, maybe first half of November time period, and in the March, first half of April time period. So we did that over the course of a number of years, looking at the different Carnegie classes, and came out with some numbers. I presented that at a conference a couple of years back. Could certainly, you know, kind of bring that to the surface again. But we do provide benchmarks for people to see. Sometimes the numbers speak for themselves. When it takes, you know, roughly 7 years for 70% of an ebook portfolio to be used. In other words, you go back 7 years, you look at the copyrights from 7 years ago, you look at how much of those copyrights have been used during that 7-year period, and you get to a number of about 70% is the benchmark for people with, for example, our ebooks. That compares very favorably to 50% of a print book portfolio being used over the course of 20 years. So just by virtue of getting your content electronically, we can show some very good, you know, improvements on print circulation. And of course, you know, we try to let people have their cake and eat it too with our licensed ebooks, because you know, you do get something called the My Copy, which is a print-on-demand feature for $25. You can get a print copy of any book the library has licensed for $25. That includes shipping. I mean, that sounds like just a pure commercial spin, but I think it's important for any of those campuses that are seeing, you know, pushback against ebooks, and to know that, you know, there's always this $25 print-on-demand button that the users can have if they need to do a kind of a full kind of serial reading front to back of a book that they have found.
Hmm.
So I hope that that gives you some sense. But we're always looking to help people benchmark. That's definitely something that account development does, and it's also important for us because there's basically two different kinds of use that is bad that we look for to intervene with, and one of those use scenarios is something was doing very well and then it drops off the table. 9 times out of 10, when something starts to go bad with a particular portfolio of electronic content, it is because there's a technical reason. Somebody somewhere, either you or us or somebody in between, has failed to make the pipeline clean, and so the use goes down. The other way, though, is what we call chronic underuse, and that's where benchmarking comes into play. If you are not getting the same kind of level of use, significantly less than schools like yourself that have the same portfolio, it's our job in account development to help you see that and to relay that to you in a non-judgmental way, but in a way that shows how we can cooperate to make it better. Okay, that's enough of that.
Yeah. Excellent. So one thing that you were talking about there relates, I think, rather neatly to one of the questions that we have here in the queue from Michelle. And I think when you were talking about the print on demand, that sort of is perhaps one portion of the answer to this question, but I think it's probably a little more complicated than that. And here Michelle asks, I may have missed it, but when purchasing ebooks, are you purchasing the book or just access to the book? In other words, how does one add an ebook to their library's permanent collection?
Yeah, I can answer that. People who have purchased Springer Nature ebooks know the answer to this, that we sell ebooks on our platform in the form of packages. That is a subject package and for any given copyright year. So, for example, you might buy physics and astronomy for 2019. Maybe there'd be 250 books projected and published in that area in 2019. Once you've bought that package, you have access to that, in perpetuity. Even though we don't put that term on our license anymore, it basically is permanent access to that content. So it's not temporary database-like access for the period of a year. It's permanent rights to the content. And you would add ebooks if you want to get them on our platform, on the primary publisher platform. You would talk to your licensing rep, and you would look at whatever packages of content made the most sense for your facility, and you would buy by the copyright year within those subjects. So that's how that's done.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. So we've got a sort of a big question here, I think, that might be interesting to get each of your perspectives on. Greg asks, how do you see the role of scholarly publishers evolving in the current environment and the foreseeable future?
Wow.
Dan.
Well, I've only got 7 minutes, so hard to do it justice. Okay, good question. What time frame are we talking about? Let's say 10 years or something like that, right? Because beyond that it gets difficult. It gets quite difficult after 2 years. So I think there are several things to talk about. And Bob, you might disagree. Feel free to jump in. This is purely a personal perspective. There is an ongoing need to both filter but also provide very comprehensive view across a wide range of topics and subjects, and indeed different levels of and types of research. But there is, we would still say, a strong need for us to provide that organizing filter, peer review, and indeed technical filters to allow people to not only search and identify, but also to be alerted to relevant content to them. The role of publishers in doing that is, increasingly blurred when it comes to other online providers. But at the end of the day, we would like to say that we have a history of connections, connectivity, reputation that we still feel sits proudly, and we can stand up tall next to and therefore the connections with our reviewers, our editors, our internal subject experts, publishing editorial, and indeed our internal technical teams provide quite a lot of value in terms of those researcher needs. And the needs aren't changing quite as quickly as sometimes we would all like, I think. Sometimes they're changing very slowly. And when they're changing slowly, we need to make sure that we're still providing reputational. So its reputation is the immediate thing. And then there's innovation, and it's interesting, Springer and Nature coming together a couple of years ago. I came from the Nature side. The question of innovation, the degree to which we should all be developing and trying to keep up with the Joneses and keep up with technical developments, it's a really hard question to answer. You're either ahead of the curve or behind the curve. It's very hard to be on the curve. And you had the interesting cultural differences where Nature was maybe a little more sort of innovative with all the hazards that comes with, and Springer was a little bit more, well, let's deliver the things that the customers really need right now. And so we're continuing to innovate and trying to develop and try and predict what's new and get there, but try and do it with customers at the same time rather than, go too far ahead. My job, I'm very lucky. I hear what customers think, and quite often we get told, all that stuff's very nice. It's all very interesting. Advancing scholarly communication is important, but please get my review back to me on time. Get the basics right as well. Yeah. So there's a focus on balancing those basics with those innovations. I still need 7 minutes. Sorry.
I think I would just also point out that we're in a time when people shouldn't disregard the fact that we do our publishing job at an enormous scale. Some people have offered solutions that are interesting in small ways, but that may indeed contribute in their own way. But doing things at a web scale, at a worldwide scale, is kind of what we know how to do. The challenge for us, I think, as a scholarly publisher is doing what we're doing right now, and that is balancing a lot of different business models all in the air at the same time. And, we have the gold open access model. We have, scholarly sharing going on. We have lots of different models that we're using. There's the read and publish model that people are probably aware of, where you kind of flip the payments of a large chunk of clients into kind of the paying for APC or article processing charges for open access authorship. And so I think the challenge for us is to see how long we can balance all these business models and how we will work to transition them as we go forward. But we're doing it now, so that means it can be done. I think we should get some credit for it, actually. But that's the scholarly publishing landscape. I will also say this, that part of my mission, kind of nowadays, is to actually engage with scholarly communications librarians more on an equal basis, and not in some adversarial manner, but to actually talk about the scholarly landscape, kind of in civil terms, and take up that conversation at a pretty deep level.
One brief thing to add, because it's top of my mind, is that I think we're very much still focused on the value of the people. Maybe like librarians. I mean, someone said to me the other day, the degree to actually the value of what they see in the publisher is that they're able to talk to someone who recognizes, understands, and can read the research that they're publishing, and can talk about it in a way and think about the right way of both publishing it and promoting it. And there are technical solutions, of course, which we want to take advantage of, but at the same time we very much do, I think, recognize the value of having expert people in-house, and we don't want to lose that at all. But very similar to demonstrating the value of the library, and then demonstrating the value of the publisher is a challenge that we have too, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting and thoughtful place to start wrapping up. I would note that we have several questions that have come through about where folks can find the white paper. And what I would say to that, and what I have been informed of, is that everybody who registered for this webinar should receive a link to a direct download of the white paper when it's published. It's not quite published yet, but in the very near future it will be, and you should receive some communication from Springer Nature that will allow you to access it. All right. So.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Great. So as we're wrapping up here, I would just say we have plenty of questions in the queue, but our time is limited today. I see that there are a couple of email addresses there. If there are other things, I imagine folks can reach out.
I was going to say, Mark, and I hope I speak for you as well, Bob, that please, certainly in my role, it's my job to understand and hear what people think. So I very much genuinely do want to hear from people. If they agree, disagree, whatever it might be, want to tell me something else, then please get in touch. I've got several projects at the moment where I need to talk to a few librarians about a few things, so you'll be doing me a favor. If you want to ask me if I can help you out in any way, then please let me know, and I'll do my best to try and answer any further questions. Bob?
And anything that relates to account development, and I see some questions that have to do with discovery and engagement and how we work with clients, I'm glad to respond to those directly. That's what I do every day. We definitely have various techniques of how we intervene. So I'm glad to share anything about how we do account development with the people who can send to robert.boise@springer.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Dan. We appreciate the time that you spent with us today and the presentation and all the information that you've shared. Really excellent stuff, I think. And I would just remind everybody out there that we did record today's program, so you can be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice with a link to the recording of this. And also, you should see in your chat box there a little link to a 5-question survey that I would ask you if you have a few minutes here as we transition into the next hour. If you could take a few minutes and fill that out and let us know how we did, we would really appreciate that. Thanks everybody out there for showing up today and for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope the rest of your day is great.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.